Order. We now come to motion number 2 on standards. The motion to be moved by the Leader of the House. The Leader of the House, Andrea Leadsom.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the motion standing in my name on the order paper. It is always regrettable when the House has to debate a motion of this kind, and we do so following a full process of investigation and consideration by a recognised due process. This motion follows the publication of the Committee on Standards' third report of the session on the Honourable Member for North Antrim. The report was published on Wednesday the 18th of July, and the Government has sought to schedule a debate as quickly as possible in line with usual practice. The matters before the House today have been investigated by the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards and now reported on by the Committee on Standards. I thank the former Commissioner, Catherine Hudson, and the current Commissioner, Catherine Stone, for their work. I also thank the Right Honourable Member for Rother Valley, Chair of the Committee on Standards, and other members of the committee for their work in producing last week's report. The committee has concluded that there has been a failure to meet the standards expected by the House, and the committee considers that the Honourable Member for North Antrim has committed serious misconduct. Honourable and Right Honourable Members may have noticed that the motion originally tabled to remaining orders last week has been slightly altered. This follows correspondence between myself and the Chair of the Committee on Standards, in which he clarified the committee's recommendations. The Right Honourable Member for Rother Valley's letter reads, "The committee's recommendation was that Mr Paisley should be suspended from the service of the House for a period of 30 sitting days, beginning on the 4th of September. The intention of the committee was that Mr Paisley should forfeit his parliamentary salary for an equivalent period, i.e. 30 days. However, I understand that the effect of simply suspending him for a period of 30 sitting days without making separate provision for his salary is likely to be that he will automatically forfeit that salary for a longer period than 30 days because of the inclusion of non-sitting days in the overall period of suspension. That was not the committee's intention." Mr Speaker, I have therefore tabled today's motion that reflects the committee's intended recommendations. The motion before the House today therefore approves the report of the Committee on Standards, endorses the recommendations of the committee and proposes suspension for 30 sitting days and withdrawal of the Honourable Member for North Antrim's salary for 30 days. I commend this motion to the House.
Thank you. The question is the motion on standards as on the order paper. The opposition front bench does not wish to contribute. No. The Chair of the Standards Committee, Sir Kevin Barron.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I shall not detain the House long because all the relevant arguments and background material are set out in the Committee on Standards report and in the memorandum from the Independent Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, which accompanies it. I have to say the investigation did start under Catherine Hudson, who, as the Leader of the House said, and both commissioners did a meticulous job of investigating this matter over many months. They point out that the process could have been considerably shorter if Mr Paisley had been more cooperative initially, though the current commissioner is also careful to point out that in the later stages of her inquiry, Mr Paisley showed a greater sense of urgency and was proactive in putting together costings for his visits to Sri Lanka. It is those visits which is at the heart of our inquiry. Mr Paisley made 3 visits to that country in 2013, all of them paid for by the Sri Lankan government. The first 2 visits in March and April and July 2013 also involved members of Mr Paisley's family. 5 family members of the first visit, 3 on the second visit. At that time, the threshold above which a visit had to be registered in the register of members' financial interests was £660. It is still not firmly established how much the 2 earlier visits in 2013 cost, but Mr Paisley, who initially argued for a cost in the area of £20,000, now accepts a figure of £50,000. In our view, and the Commissioner's, it may have been much higher than that. The point is that the cost massively exceeded the threshold for registration, but Mr Paisley did not register either visit. He travelled again to Sri Lanka in November 2013, again at the expense of the government there, to attend the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Colombo. On that occasion, he travelled without his family, and he did punctually declare the financial benefits he received. In March 2014, Mr Paisley wrote to the Prime Minister, along with other MPs, urging the British government to change its foreign policy towards Sri Lanka by withdrawing its stated support for a UN resolution setting up an international investigation into human rights abuses. In this letter, he did not declare any of the financial benefits he and his family had received from Sri Lankan government in the previous 12 months. The Commissioner found that Mr Paisley was in breach of the rules related to the registration in respect of the 2 earlier visits in 2013. He accepts this. She also finds that he breached the rules by not making a declaration in his letter to the Prime Minister, and most serious of all, that he breached the rule against paid advocacy in that letter by lobbying the British government to confer an exclusive benefit on a foreign government from which he and his family had accepted financial benefits within 12 months of having received them. Mr Paisley disputed these findings of the Commissioner. On his failure to declare, the Commissioner points out that his arguments are based on a misunderstanding of the rules. We share the Commissioner's view and concluded that Mr Paisley was in breach of the rules of declaration. On paid advocacy, the situation is slightly more complicated, but we and the Commissioner both came to a clear decision. Mr Paisley argues that he did not breach the paid advocacy rule on 2 grounds. The first is that the rule, as it stood in 2014, prohibits advocacy which seeks to confer benefit exclusively upon a body outside Parliament from which members had received a financial benefit. Mr Paisley claims that his letter to the Prime Minister was not seeking to confer a benefit exclusively upon Sri Lanka because the British government stood to benefit too because, and I quote, it would not have had to pay for the internationalisation of the internal political affairs of another country through the auspices of the UN. End of quote. We were not persuaded by these arguments. We point out that in the diplomatic terms, the UK would arguably have suffered at least as much as it gained by withdrawing its publicly announced support from an initiative aimed at promoting international human rights observance. In financial terms, Mr Paisley supplied no evidence to support his view that this shift in policy would have saved money for the UK government. We think that it is entirely reasonable to interpret his letter to the Prime Minister as seeking to confer a benefit exclusively on the Sri Lankan government. Mr Paisley's other arguments arises from an apparent inconsistency in the guidance provided in 2014 on the paid advocacy rule. The Registrar Member's financial interest drew our attention to this matter, which had not been raised by the Commissioner's original memorandum, and we thought it only fair to share the information with Mr Paisley and offer him the opportunity to submit further evidence addressing this point. He has done so, and we have carefully considered it. I should mention that we and the Commissioner have been careful throughout this investigation to assess Mr Paisley's conduct against the rules and the guidance which actually applied back in 2013 and 2014, taking no account of any subsequent modifications which are not relevant to the case. Although we acknowledge there was indeed inconsistent guidance in 2014, something that the House has subsequently put right, we are clear that this does not exonerate Mr Paisley from breaching the advocacy rule. We set out our reasons in paragraph 27 of the report. I will mention here just the first reason, because it is decisive in itself. Even if one accepts Mr Paisley's interpretation of the rule rather than that of successive commissioners, it would only exempt Mr Paisley's own visit to Sri Lanka from the application of the rule. It would not exempt those of his family, which represents a significant financial benefit received by Mr Paisley. So we were in no doubt that the Commissioner was right to find that Mr Paisley breached the rules in respect of registration, declaration and paid advocacy. In assessing a suitable sanction, we considered what might be taken to be mitigating and aggravating factors. Mitigating factors are Mr Paisley's apology for failing to register, his recent activity in analysing the likely cost of the visit, and his acceptance that he needed a far greater understanding of the rules. Aggravating factors are the scale of the unregistered, undeclared hospitality received by him and his family, grounds for thinking that the failure to register was, to use the Commissioner's words, not inadvertent, and his delays in dealing with the Commissioner in the early stages of her inquiry. Taking these factors into account, we concluded that Mr Paisley had committed serious misconduct and that his actions, I quote, were of a nature to bring the House of Commons into disrepute, which is a further breach of the Code of Conduct. Because we regard this as an especially serious case, we have recommended that Mr Paisley be suspended from the service of the House for a period of 30 sitting days starting on the 4th of September. The motion before the House today makes separate provision for the withdrawal of Mr Paisley's salary, and I should say a word or two about explanation about that. The intention of the committee was that Mr Paisley should be suspended from the service of the House for 30 days and that he should forfeit his parliamentary salary for the equivalent period. That is also 30 days. However, I had been advised that the effect of simply suspending him for 30 days, sitting days, without making separate provision for his salary is likely to be that he will automatically forfeit that salary for a longer period than 30 days because of the inclusion of non-sitting days in the overall period of suspension. And that was not the committee's intention. In retrospect, we could have been clearer about this in the wording of our report. And I am therefore grateful to the Leader of the House for having acceded to my request for tables today's motion, in which a form makes clear what the committee's intention is and which avoids any ambiguity over the period of time for which Mr Paisley's salary will be withdrawn. We also recommend that Mr Paisley should register the benefits he received from the Sri Lankan government, which will be italicised in the register to indicate that they are a late entry. And finally, I should mention that the lay members of the committee played a full and active part in the drawing up of the committee's report, which they are in full agreement with. Thank you.
Order. The question is the motion on standards as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. The House has agreed to the motion in the name of the Leader of the House to suspend the Honourable Gentleman, the Member for North Antrim, for 30 sitting days. Under the terms, colleagues, of Section 5 of the Recall of MPs Act 2015, I am now required to write to the relevant electoral officer informing him or her that a member has met one of the conditions which makes the member subject to a recall petition under that Act, namely that, following on from a report from the Committee on Standards in relation to the MP, the House of Commons has ordered the suspension of the member from the service of the House for a period of 10 days or more. The recall petition will be administered in accordance with the provisions of the Act by that electoral officer. And for those who take a keen interest in these matters, and I am partly taking the time to state all this because it is the first occasion upon which I have been required to act, I would add that the electoral officer has 10 working days to set up and open the petition for signature, or longer if it is not practicable to do it within that time. If the petition achieves the necessary number of signatures, at least 10% of the number of eligible registered electors in that constituency, in the specified period, 6 weeks, the electoral officer notifies me and the seat is made vacant from the date of that notification. I hope that that's a helpful explanation to the House. This is a a regrettable state of affairs, but I thank the leader for what she said in moving the motion, and I'd like to thank the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Chair of the Standards Committee, for briefing the House in the way that he has done.